What if art was an expression but a summoning? What if every movement of the body, every tremor of muscle, every measured breath pulled something ancient into the room? Something watching, something choosing, something waiting to be reborn. Suspiria is not a film about witches hiding inside a dance academy. It is a film about ritual hiding inside art. Dance is not performance. It is invocation. The body is not a vessel. It is a sigillant inscription drawn in flesh, carved in motion, capable of opening doors no hand could touch. When Susie steps into the Tanz Academy, she believes she is entering a world of discipline, beauty, and technique. But the mirrored walls are not mirrors. They are surveillance. The wooden floors are not practice space. The choreography is not artistic direction. It is a coded language spoken by those who understand that movement can command reality itself. Every turn, every fall, every contortion, every synchronized pattern feeds the coven's machinery. Channeling pain, channeling will. Channeling the raw electricity of human effort into something supernatural, not magic in the childish sense, but power as old as myth. And Susie, unknowingly, steps into the center of an occult architecture where the dancers are acolytes. The studio is a ritual temple, and the coven is a system of control disguised as mentorship. She thinks she is learning. They think they are shaping her. But the real truth sits beneath the boards, breathing in the dark, waiting for the moment when art reveals its true nature, a ritual of breaking and becoming. In Suspiria, beauty is a trap. Discipline is a spell. The dance is only the beginning. Long before his name became a metaphor for systems that devour their own people, Moloch existed as an architecture. A blueprint of power carved into the bones of ancient cities, structures so meticulously designed that even after the idol crumbled, the logic continued to function on its own, like a machine that refuses to die. Carthage was not merely a place on a map, but the first great engine built upon this design, a sprawling labyrinth of altars, furnaces, and civic squares arranged around the idea that collective survival must be purchased through deliberate loss, and at the center of this engine stood the bronze figure, bull-headed hollow-bodied arms extended over a pit of fire that never truly went cold. Its metal skin hammered by artisans who understood that a god of necessity could not be carved gently. And in the glow of that furnace, the city organized its hierarchy, from priests who interpreted the flames to nobles whose lineage was tied to their willingness to give, to the crowds who watched the offerings vanish into heat so intense it warped the air into wavering ghostlight. This was not chaos, but order sharpened to cruelty, kind of order that can only exist when a society convinces itself that the most painful act is also the most rational. And within this architecture, every movement, every decision, every breath had a place. The drummers who beat rhythms that drowned human cries, not as sadists, but as necessary components of the machine. The scribes who recorded each offering in clay tablets, turning grief into data. The officials who stood stone-faced as the flames licked their decisions clean of mercy. And beneath it all, the belief that the fire was not a punishment, but a negotiation. That existence itself was a pact with forces too cold and vast to appease with anything less than what was irreplaceable. Yet the true genius of this architecture was not in the ritual, but in the way it reshaped the thoughts of those who lived. Inside it, teaching them from birth that fear was wisdom, that the collective outweighed the individual, that virtue meant obedience to a logic older than love. Even the Tophet, that wide ceremonial field where urns of ash were buried layer upon layer, was arranged like a memory system, a reminder built into the stone that the city survived only because the fire was fed. And in this order, children were not viewed as victims but as currency. The highest denomination in a cosmic economy, none dared question. However, this architecture was not confined to Carthage, for its principles spread like a blueprint for civilizations seeking control in a world hostile and unpredictable. And soon, kingdoms across the Levant whispered of gods who demanded the firstborn, not out of sadism, but out of the cold arithmetic of survival. And when the Hebrew prophets condemned Moloch's rites with legal language rather than poetry, it was because they recognized not superstition but a competing system, a rival architecture of power capable of swallowing nations whole. The threat was never the idol itself, but the structure of thought that formed around it. A structure so resilient it could shed temples, cultures, even millennia without losing its shape. And as centuries churned forward, the bronze body melted into legend. But the architecture remained, resurfacing in empires that required sacrifice for order, in armies that demanded suns for stability, in political structures that treated human life as fuel. And by the time the ancient world ended, the machine had already become self-repairing, capable of operating without priests, without idols, without name. Because once a society internalizes the belief that suffering is the foundation of stability, once it accepts that innocence must be spent to preserve structure, the architecture no longer needs walls or altars, becomes a city built inside the human mind. And that is the true terror of Moloch. His temple was never destroyed. It's only relocated from the furnaces of Carthage into the quiet mechanisms of the systems we move through daily. Systems that whisper the same ancient promise in a modern tongue, that order is fragile, that chaos waits just outside, that the fire must be fed. No. If you listen closely, sometimes in the pause between obligations, in the breath before you choose duty over desire, you can hear the echo of that old metal idol warming itself beneath the surface of your world. Waiting for the next offering you do not yet realize you are preparing to give. Before any flame was lit, before any child was lifted toward the bronze arms of the furnace god, Moloch had already spoken, not through words, but through symbols that carved themselves into the psyche of the ancient world like commandments written in fire. For the bull's head was never a mere artistic choice. It was an announcement of dominion, a face shaped to broadcast a truth older than Scripture, that raw power does not negotiate, that strength without empathy becomes a form of gravity pulling all lesser wills into orbit. And those who approached the idol understood instantly that they were standing before an authority that could not be swayed by pleading or prayer. The bull's gaze, unblinking and eternal, communicated a single message: whatever you love can be taken, whatever you cherish can be consumed. And beneath that gaze, the outstretched arms of Moloch formed the most deceptive gesture ever crafted by human hands. A gesture of welcome, of supposed protection, as though the god were reaching to embrace his people, drawing them nearer. Yet the tilt of those arms served only one purpose: to guide the offering downward into the furnace hidden within his hollow metal body. This is the essence of Moloch's symbolic language, the illusion of safety masking the architecture of destruction, the promise of stability concealing the mechanics of sacrifice, embrace that is also an execution, a cradle that leads inevitably into flame. To stand before this image was to feel the seduction of order, the comfort of surrender, the terrifying ease of giving something away because the structure around you insists it is the only way to survive. And deeper still, there is the hollow cavity within the idol, the blazing interior that transformed the image of a god into a machine. A chamber designed not for presence but for consumption, a heart made of fire instead of flesh. A reminder that in this system nothing offered is ever returned, nothing burned is ever restored. This was the silent language of the furnace. What enters does not emerge. The material of the statue bronze magnified this message, its reflective surface capturing the glow of the flames in a way that made the idol appear alive, breathing with heat, shimmering as though its skin were made of molten authority. Bronze does not crack under fire, it thrives in it. And in this immortality, the worshippers saw not a symbol, but a truth. The god does not suffer the cost, only the giver does. The god remains while the offering vanishes, and as this symbolism soaked into the culture, it created a worldview in which loss became logic, in which pain became proof, in which value was measured by the degree of sacrifice endured, and from this worldview emerged the rituals that turned living bodies into currency. Yet the language of Moloch did not end with antiquity, for symbols evolve faster than myths die. And in the modern world, his bull's head reappears in unexpected places, in the charging bull statue of financial districts, in the logos of institutions that celebrate aggression as progress, in the metallic gleam of corporate towers that rise over cities like modern altars to efficiency. Today, the outstretched arms reappear as the stretch of policies that promise protection while funneling individuals into systems designed to drain their time, health, and humanity, and the hollow furnace manifests as the invisible engines of industry, war, and digital empires, machines that feed on attention, labor, and compliance until the giver is reduced to embers. In this way, the ancient sigil of Moloch has become abstract, yet more pervasive than ever. For when a symbol leaves stone and migrates into behavior, into expectation, into the choices people believe they must make, it no longer needs temples. It becomes a lens through which reality is organized. This is why the symbol of fire persists, not the flame itself. The belief that destruction is the price of survival, that something must always be sacrificed to keep the world from collapsing. And as you trace these symbols from bull to flame to hollow chest to modern machinery, you begin to see that they were never instructions for worship, but instructions for obedience. A silent language that trains entire civilizations to accept harm as a necessity. This is the true power of symbols, for they do not force devotion, they shape perception. In the moment a society learns to read sacrifice as stability, Moloch no longer needs priests to speak for him. The people become the choir, repeating the same ancient refrain without ever realizing its origin. And so the language of Moloch lives on, not in the heat of a bronze furnace, but in the glow of screens, in the pulse of industries that burn through lives in pursuit of growth, in the rituals of nations that build peace from the ashes of their own children. If you look closely enough at the bull statues, the corporate sigils, and the political gestures that masquerade as protection, you will see that the old god speaks fluently in the symbols of our age. Whispering the same command he gave thousands of years ago, "What you offer willingly, I will gladly take." Before bronze was shaped into idols, and before scripture carved its warnings into stone, blood was already speaking the first. Language humanity ever truly understood, a language older than prayer, older than law, older even than fear itself. The idea that life could be traded for stability, that suffering could purchase order, that pain could persuade the universe to be merciful. And nowhere did this ancient logic burn more fiercely than in Carthage, where the Tophet's open-air sanctuaries of ash and silence stood as monuments to a belief system that fused religion with raw survival. When archaeologists unearthed the urns buried beneath those crimson layers of earth, they did not find myth or rumor. They found bone fragments of infants and animals arranged with ritual precision. Interred under steles inscribed to Baal-Haman, Tanit, and the unnamed force the Hebrews called Moloch, these layers were not chaos but chronology, a ledger written in ash. Each urn a receipt of a transaction made between a desperate people and the forces they believed governed the fates of nations. To the modern mind, this reads as horror, cruelty, madness, but to the ancient world, this was logic as sharp as a blade. If the gods control the rains, the soil, the armies, the seasons, then the gods can be bargained with. And what better currency than the most precious life one could offer, not because the community hated its children, but because their innocence was the highest possible proof of sincerity, the purest demonstration of devotion. This was not a crime, it was contract. Not an atrocity, but arithmetic. In a world where drought could spell extinction and a single plague could erase an entire generation, faith was not enough. Only sacrifice could tip the scale. And the flames of Moloch did not simply consume, they transformed uncertainty into assurance, turning terror into the illusion of control. For once the offering was made, the people could tell themselves they had done everything, that the rest now lay in the hands of the divine. The drums that drowned the screams were part of the ritual, not to hide guilt, but to maintain collective focus, to keep doubt from fracturing the unity required for the transaction to succeed. And the priests who stood by the flames were not villains, but custodians of a cosmic exchange, ensuring that the ritual maintained its integrity. What haunts us today is the brutal clarity of their logic. The more painful the offering, the more persuasive. The greater the loss, the greater the divine attention. In this worldview, suffering was not incidentally, was the currency itself. This logic was not unique to Carthage. For across the ancient world, the arithmetic of blood reappeared with unnerving consistency. The Aztecs tore hearts from living bodies to ensure the sun would rise, believing the cosmos collapsed without nourishment.
Ash.
The Ashvametahorse sacrifices of ancient India demanded months of preparation and participation from entire kingdoms. Medieval Europe burned heretics to purify the collective soul, believing that doctrinal corruption posed a danger greater than the flesh of a single life. In each of these rituals, the same chilling equation held true. Blood equals order, pain equals protection, the innocent equals the indispensable. And once a society accepts this equation, it becomes a system, a machinery powered by offerings, indifferent to the morality of individuals. Moloch was merely the name carved into one of the earliest versions of this machinery. But systems built on sacrifice do not vanish. They adapt, and while the bronze furnace is cooled, its logic burns everywhere around us. Today we no longer call it sacrifice, we call it cost. We call it necessity. We call it progress, and yet the pattern is unchanged. People surrender their health to keep their jobs, their time with family to keep their status, their peace of mind to keep their place in an economy that demands endless offerings. Nations send young bodies to war for security stability. Leverage, entire ecosystems are burned, poisoned, stripped bare, so that industries may survive another quarter. And behind each of these modern altars is the same ancient arithmetic. The more irreplaceable the offering, the more powerful its effect. The suffering is not a flaw, it is the point. This is why the image of the furnace endures. Not as a physical structure, but as a metaphor for every system that thrives on loss, every machine that runs on the quiet, unseen depletion of human life. And truth that makes Moloch terrifying is not that ancient flames once swallowed the innocent, but that we still obey the logic that built those flames, still make sacrifices dressed in new language, still offer our most precious hours, years, and futures to structures we believe cannot survive without them. Blood was the first currency, but it was never retired. It was simply translated into forms that modern society finds easier to justify. And if you listen beneath the hum of machines, beneath the rhetoric of politicians, beneath the grind of daily obligation, you can still hear the echo of the ancient furnace whispering the same demand it made thousands of years ago. Give me what hurts, and I will give you order. Long after the last furnace in Carthage cooled into silence, the logic that fed it refused to die because Moloch was never merely a god of fire. He was a contract, a structure of incentives so powerful that it could survive the fall of temples, the collapse of empires, even the disappearance of belief itself. To understand Moloch is to understand the machinery of agreements that bind entire civilizations, agreements that do not require faith, only compliance. In the ancient world, the pact was literal, sealed by blood and heat, a negotiation between mortals and the divine. We give what is most precious. You grant what is beyond our control. But as societies evolved, the gods receded and the contracts remained reappearing in forms so subtle that people no longer recognize them as the same ancient bargain. This is where Moloch becomes dangerous, for a contract that hides its own terms is far harder to refuse. Poets and philosophers sensed this before historians did. Allen Ginsberg, in his howl of rage against industrial modernity, invoked Moloch not as a demon but as a devouring logic, a skyline of steel and glass that fed on human lives. And decades later, Scott Alexander rewrote the myth again, describing Moloch as a force that emerges wherever competition pushes individuals to sacrifice their values simply to survive the game. A self-reinforcing pattern in which no one intends the cruelty, yet everyone contributes to it. This is the essence of the pact. No signature, no priest, no ritual, just a series of choices that feel harmless when isolated, but catastrophic when multiplied across millions. In this contract, each participant behaves rationally, yet collectively produces outcomes that no one wants over work. Burnout, exploitation, war, ecological collapse, justified as necessary because the alternative is worse. And here lies the twist that makes Moloch's pact uniquely monstrous. No one actually wants to serve him. Yet the game is designed so that refusing to do so feels like self-destruction. This is why the ancients spoke of gods whose hunger could never be satisfied, not because they believed in supernatural appetite, but because they recognized a pattern in human systems that punished mercy and rewarded sacrifice. Moloch is the god of difficult choices. It's the deity of no good options, the ruler of situations in which every path forward demands a loss. And in modern life, the pact reappears in countless forms. The worker who sacrifices health for stability, knowing refusal means unemployment. The politician who sacrifices truth to protect power, knowing honesty would end their influence. The corporation that sacrifices ethical responsibility to compete, knowing restraint would lead to financial collapse? Each of these choices is framed as necessary, strategic. Unavoidably, together they recreate the same furnace logic, the same ritual architecture, the same invisible altar upon which countless offerings are made. This is the contract that governs modern existence, a deal you never consciously agreed to, but whose terms you obey daily. And the most disturbing element is this: unlike ancient sacrifices, modern offerings are diffuse, scattered, hidden, allowing the system to operate without ever revealing the total cost. One life here, one dream there, a family fractured, a decade burned away, none catastrophic enough alone to expose the pattern, but together, forming a river of loss, flowing endlessly into the heart of the machine. This fragmentation is what gives Moloch his modern power, for when harm is distributed across millions of hands, responsibility dissolves, guilt evaporates, and the system remains blameless. The contract is upheld not through authority, but through incentives, through the quiet understanding that those who give more time, more loyalty, more silence are rewarded, while those who hesitate are punished. This is the logic of Moloch's pact. The furnace does not burn because someone commands it to. It burns because every participant believes someone else will feed it if they don't. And once this belief solidifies, the contract becomes self-executing, a machine with no off switch, a ritual without a priest, a god without a face. And even in antiquity, those who invoked Moloch knew the psychological power of embodying this logic in symbol and ceremony, which is why the elites of modern society continue to cloak themselves in imagery eerily reminiscent of ancient sacrifice. Consider the cremation of care ritual at Bohemian Grove, where the powerful gather beneath a stone owl to burn an effigy representing compassion, purging themselves of the burden of empathy so that decisive actions, political, economic, military, can be taken without hesitation. Officially satire, yet symbolically identical to the ancient purge of conscience required to maintain systems built on sacrifice. It is theater. Yes, but theater with teeth, a performance that echoes the same pact. Carthaginian nobles once accepted when they lifted their offerings toward a god whose arms promised protection and delivered only fire. In both cases, the contract is the same. To wield power, you must kill the part of yourself that hesitates. The offering may be symbolic now, but the psychology is unchanged. And so the pact of Moloch persists, not because anyone worships him, but because the logic he represents continues to govern. The games we play, the institutions we build, the choices we justify, and until that logic is broken, the contract will renew itself generation after generation. Always demanding something more, always expanding its appetite, always reminding us that in a world built on sacrifice, the most costly offerings are the ones we eventually convince ourselves were necessary, even righteous. And if you listen very carefully, beneath the hum of the modern world, you can still hear the old terms whispered like a forgotten clause in a contract no one remembers signing. Give what hurts and you will survive, refuse and you will burn. The true genius of Moloch is not in the furnace, nor in the rituals, nor even in the sacrifices themselves, but in the way he reverses the compass of morality so completely that people learn to call cruelty necessity and name their offerings virtue. In this inverted moral universe, goodness becomes a liability, mercy becomes a weakness, and empathy becomes an obstacle to survival. Because the system teaches that hesitation endangers the whole, that questioning the cost makes you disloyal, that protecting the innocent is naive. And this inversion did not vanish with antiquity, it merely refined itself into the silent codes that govern modern life, whispering through institutions, economies, and ideologies that the harshest choice is often the most responsible one. Ancient Carthaginians believed that offering their children was an act of devotion, a moral duty performed for the protection of the community. And though we recoil at the brutality, we understand the psychological trap. Once a society declares suffering as proof of commitment, compassion becomes rebellion, and refusal becomes betrayal. This is the same mechanism that shapes modern structures, not through temples of bronze, but through boardrooms, parliaments, digital networks, that reward ruthlessness disguised as pragmatism. And nowhere is this inversion more chilling than in the ritual known as the cremation of care at Bohemian Grove, a secluded forest where the world's most powerful men gather beneath a 30-foot stone owl to burn an effigy, symbolizing human empathy. A ceremony framed as theatrical satire but pulsing with the same ancient logic. Before you can lead, you must kill the part of yourself that hesitates, the part that loves, the part that cares. The owl, symbol of wisdom, becomes an idol of cold detachment, presiding over the symbolic purge of conscience. And in the glow of that fire, one glimpses the same philosophy that once animated Moloch's bronze furnace, the conviction that moral restraint is a hindrance. That emotional burden must be burned away to maintain order, and that the world can only be governed by those willing to sever their own humanity. But this code does not belong only to the elite, for it seeps downward through culture until ordinary people internalize its message. Work until exhaustion because rest is weakness. Surrender your privacy because safety requires sacrifice. Obey laws that harm you because dissent disrupts stability. Endure injustice quietly because speaking out makes things worse. This is the inverted moral code. Harm framed as protection, loss framed as progress, submission framed as responsibility. And like the Carthaginian priests who insisted the fires must burn for the good of the community, modern systems wrap their demands in noble language, national interest, economic growth, security, the greater good, phrases that sanitize sacrifice the way drums once drowned the screams. The inversion becomes complete when individuals begin to police themselves, enforcing the logic on others with the zeal once reserved for religious conviction. The mother who tells her child that suffering builds character. The employer who claims exploitation is opportunity. The politician who insists that freedom must be surrendered to preserve it. Each is a priest of the inverted temple, not out of malice but out of internalized fear that deviation from the ritual will collapse the fragile order they have been taught to protect. And the most dangerous aspect of this code is its subtlety, for it does not announce itself with altars or flames, does not command obedience with threats of divine wrath. It simply aligns itself with the incentives of the system until people willingly choose what harms them, believing they are choosing wisely, responsibly, even morally. The nurse who gives up sleep to hold a collapsing institution together, the worker who never sees his family so that a corporation may thrive, the citizen who accepts surveillance because it promises safety. Each is performing a ritual they would once have recognized as sacrifice. But under the inverted code, these acts are celebrated, praised, held up as examples of loyalty and strength. In this world, the moral person is the one who burns without complaint, the one who gives more than anyone should, the one who carries burdens too heavy for a single life. Moloch's brilliance lies in this transformation. By redefining virtue as self-destruction, he ensures that people feed the furnace without being asked. And when a society reaches this point, the system no longer needs enforcement. Individuals enforce it upon themselves, shaming those who refuse to sacrifice, glorifying those who collapse with a smile, turning suffering into an idol more powerful than any bronze bull. The ancient moralists warned against this inversion because they saw what it created, a civilization that devoured its own future while calling the act noble. And though we believe ourselves distant from that world, its architecture has merely changed shape today. The altars are invisible, sacrifices dispersed, the heat of the furnace disguised as ambition, duty, or patriotism. But the logic is identical. Stability requires loss. Loyalty requires pain. And the highest virtue is to surrender the very things that make life worth living. This is the inverted moral code of Moloch, a system in which the fire is not a punishment but a test. And the ones who burn the brightest are those who have forgotten they were never meant to be offerings at all. And if you feel, even faintly, that something in your world has taught you to trade your humanity for survival, then you already know this code. You have already lived inside it. You've already heard the whisper that turns morality upside down to protect the system. You must burn what makes you human. Rituals did not die when the temples fell. They merely learned to disguise themselves, slipping out of the smoke of ancient altars and weaving into the fabric of ordinary life so subtly that most people perform them, without ever realizing they are taking part in the same ancient choreography that once fed the bronze furnace of Moloch. For a ritual at its core is not candles, chants, or robes, is repetition with purpose. a repeated offering to a system that demands something in return. And in the modern world, these rituals multiply like shadow lattice, shaping the rhythm of existence with hands far colder than those of any priest. Consider the corporate tower, its glass skin reflecting the sky like a monolithic idol, its elevators rising and falling with the precision of a mechanical liturgy, its workers arriving at the same hour, performing the same gestures, sacrificing the same hours of their lives for a reward always just out of reach. This is a ritual. The morning commute is pilgrimage. The meeting is offering. The exhaustion is incense rising from human bodies worn thin by the demands of a system that calls itself necessary. Inside these towers, the old drums have been replaced with keyboards and the glow of screens, but the cadence is the same man. Unending summons to give more. Stay longer, burn brighter. And though no one calls it worship, the logic is unmistakable. Your time is fuel, your health is fuel. Your youth is fuel, and the machine will take it all if you let it. Step outside the corporate altar, and you find another ritual unfolding in the political arena where citizens sacrifice privacy, autonomy, and rights in exchange for the fragile illusion of safety. This too is a ceremony, votes cast not with hope but fear, laws passed with the language of protection, but written with the logic of control. Debates that mimic the old priestly proclamations that suffering is necessary for order. Surveillance becomes a kind of omniscience once attributed only to gods. And people accept it because the inverted moral code has taught them that obedience is virtue and watching is protection. Drift further into the machinery of nations and you find the most ancient ritual of all, war. A ceremony conducted on a scale so vast that its altars stretch across continents, demanding the blood of the young, the future of families, the innocence of entire generations. Nations call these offerings service, duty, sacrifice, and the flag becomes a modern idol. Its cloth fluttering like a sacred banner above the fields where thousands are offered to preserve the stability of systems that rarely serve the ones who bleed for them. This is Moloch's largest stage, where the justification of loss becomes poetry and the normalization of death becomes policy. Yet even this is not the full extent of modern ritual, for environmental destruction follows the same logic. Forests cut down as offerings to development. Rivers poisoned as offerings to industry. Climates destabilized as offerings to growth. Entire ecosystems burn to keep the machine running one more season, one more quarter, one more election cycle. The altar is the planet. The sacrifice is the future. The priests are those who insist there is no alternative. But perhaps the most insidious rituals are the ones performed alone. In silence, inside the architecture of the self, the ritual of overwork performed at midnight by a body that forgets what rest feels like. The ritual of self-blame performed by individuals convinced that their exhaustion is a personal failure rather than a demanded offering. The ritual of numbing, performed through substances, screens, and distractions that keep people from realizing how much they have already given. And the ritual of comparison, where individuals sacrifice their joy to maintain an image demanded by social systems that measure worth through productivity, fame, or possession. These are not accidents, they are engineered patterns. Self-reinforcing loops designed to keep the furnace burning without revealing where the heat truly comes from. Modern rituals hide behind the illusion of choice. The worker chooses over time. The soldier chooses enlistment. The consumer chooses the product. The citizen chooses the restriction. But choices made under coercion, scarcity, or fear are not choices, they are offerings, framed as voluntary to absolve the system of blame. This is Moloch's greatest adaptation, the decentralization of the altar. No more temples, no more priests, so every participant becomes both worshiper and offering, feeding the furnace with pieces of themselves while insisting the ritual is normal, necessary, inevitable. And if one stands back far enough, if one zooms out of the city, the nation, the network, a terrifying image emerges. Millions of tiny rituals performed simultaneously. Each a small flame, each a small loss, each invisible on its own, yet together forming a fire so vast and persistent that it illuminates the entire structure of modern civilization. The ancient temple has become the world itself, the furnace distributed across billions of interactions, each sustaining the system without revealing its total cost. And this is the truth societies fear to confront, that we have not abandoned the logic of sacrifice, we have perfected it. Industrialized it, digitized it, normalized it so thoroughly that the rituals no longer look like rituals at all. Yet if you pause even briefly and examine the shape of the world around you, you will recognize the pattern instantly. Repetition, offering, exhaustion, compliance. All performed beneath symbols that promise safety while concealing the hunger of the system behind them. The drums of Carthage have been replaced by the hum of machines, the flicker of screens, the ticking of clocks. But the rhythm remains unchanged. The rhythm of ritual, everywhere, endless. Feeding a fire that no longer needs a god because the world itself has become the altar. Awakening from Moloch's architecture is not a moment of enlightenment, but a slow, disorienting unmasking, the kind that feels less like revelation and more like the uncomfortable recognition that the world you live in has been whispering the same command for your entire life. Give more, burn more, surrender more. At first, the signs appear subtle, the fatigue that never quite leaves. The sense that every choice feels like a narrowing corridor. The creeping suspicion that the sacrifices you make are not leading to the future you were promised, but feeding something you cannot see. And when this realization first flickers, most people extinguish it immediately, because to question the furnace is to question the structure of reality itself. And it is easier, safer, quieter to continue participating than to confront the possibility that the rituals were never meant for your benefit. But awakening begins the moment you refuse to look away, when you allow yourself to trace the lines of the system outward, beyond your individual struggles, beyond your private sense of burden, until the pattern becomes impossible to deny. Millions of people sacrificing in synchrony, all believing they are the only ones suffering, all convinced the offering is their personal failing rather than a demand engineered by the architecture they inhabit. The first act of awakening is clearly seeing the cost. It's the coercion, the structure, the hungarnd, breaking the spell of distance that allows systems to hide their damage. Distance is Moloch's greatest ally, for when you cannot see the harm, you cannot question the ritual. Collapse that distance, and the logic begins to crumble. Awareness is a dangerous force, because the moment you perceive the furnace, you are no longer fuel by default. But awareness alone is insufficient, for the system has ways of absorbing it, of turning outrage into performance and rebellion into commodity. True awakening requires a shift not just in perception, but in participation, a refusal to continue feeding the machine, even when the incentives scream that refusal is suicide. This refusal can take many forms. Small at first, a worker declining the overtime that steals their health, a family choosing time over status, citizen rejecting narratives built on fear, an individual protecting their attention from systems designed to consume it. Each refusal is a fracture in the architecture, a hairline crack that weakens the invisible walls of the furnace. But awakening must also happen at the collective level, because Moloch thrives in the belief that we stand alone in our suffering, that our sacrifices are isolated and therefore necessary. Once people see the shared nature of their offerings, how the exhaustion of the worker echoes the burnout of the nurse, how the despair of the debtor mirrors the anxiety of the student, how the fear of the citizen mirrors the pressure of the soldier, the architecture begins to reveal its true shape. A system that survives only because individuals believe the cost is theirs to bear alone. Collective awakening is the moment these isolated flames converge and illuminate each other, showing that the furnace is not destiny, merely design. And when enough people recognize the design, the system loses its inevitability. This is Moloch's deepest fear, not rebellion, not violence, but clarity. For clarity destroys the illusion that suffering is natural, that sacrifice is required, that the rules of the game are unchangeable. Clarity is the moment people realize the altar was built by human hands and can be dismantled by them. Yet dismantling the system does not mean escaping sacrifice entirely, for trade-offs will always exist in any society. The difference lies in who sets the terms, who benefits from the cost, who decides what is necessary. Moloch's architecture operates on the premise that the many must burn for the few, that stability requires cruelty, that order is purchased through loss. Awakening turns this premise upside down and demands systems in which sacrifice is no longer the default engine of progress, but a conscious, transparent choice, shared equitably rather than extracted silently. Envisioning such systems is difficult because Moloch has trained us to think in binaries: obey or collapse, sacrifice or suffer, burn or be burned. But once the spell breaks, once the logic is exposed, new possibilities emerge. Economies that value sustainability over endless consumption, workplaces that protect human life instead of draining it, governments that safeguard autonomy rather than eroding it, cultures that reward care rather than cremating it. And in these new structures, the furnace does not disappear, but its fire is repurposed, used to warm rather than destroy, to craft rather than consume. This is the moment awakening becomes transformation, the recognition that systems are not gods but tools, and that tools can be reshaped when their current form harms more than it sustains. And though the transition is never easy, and though those who benefit from the current architecture will resist fiercely, the first step is always the same: a single person seeing clearly, refusing silently, choosing differently, and in doing so weakening the ancient pact that has bound humanity for millennia. Because Moloch does not fear revolution, he fears recognition. He fears the collective murmur that spreads when people realize their suffering is not destiny but design. He fears the moment eyes meet across the firelight and understand that the furnace has no power without those who feed it. Awakening's not a blaze then, but a whisper, quiet knowing that grows a refusal that spreads, a clarity that multiplies until the architecture of sacrifice, once thought eternal, begins to tremble. And if you have heard even a faint echo of that whisper while listening to this, then you have already stepped outside the furnace, already begun the slow, dangerous, essential work of reclaiming a world that was never meant to burn you to keep itself alive. And so the furnace dims, not because its hunger is gone, but because for the first time you have seen the shape of the machine that fed it. The architecture of sacrifice does not collapse in a single moment, yet every act of awareness weakens its walls. Every refusal cools its embers. Remember this, as you leave the ashes behind: Moloch survives only through the offerings we continue to make. And tonight you have learned to withhold your fire. But the ritual is not over. In the next descent, we open the gates to a deeper throne, the domain of the 12 kings.